Welcome. In this extremely boring episode, we will slowly explore the early history of the Roman Empire. There will be no excitement, no dramatic events, and no sudden changes, only a calm, steady, and uneventful flow of time. The Roman Empire began as a very small settlement, located near the Tiber River. At first, it was not powerful, not wealthy, and not particularly important. It was simply a quiet collection of huts, basic shelters, and narrow dirt paths. Life moved slowly. People woke up early, worked throughout the day, and rested when the light faded. Most days were very similar to one another. There were no major developments, and no urgent matters. Time passed gradually, without pressure, and without urgency. The early inhabitants of Rome focused on routine tasks, such as farming, repairing simple structures, and maintaining basic order. Nothing needed to happen quickly. Decisions were made carefully, and often repeated. Small problems were addressed, one at a time. There was no rush to change anything. As years went by, Rome remained modest and relatively calm. Growth did not occur suddenly. It happened through repetition, through habit, and through consistency. People followed established rules, and those rules rarely changed. Meetings were held regularly, many of them long and uneventful. Discussions continued, often without leading to immediate action. Rome expanded its influence little by little, not because of excitement, but because of organization. Structures were built carefully, roads were planned slowly, and systems were gradually introduced. Everything required time, a great deal of time. There was no pressure to move faster. If you are still awake, that is perfectly fine. Nothing important is happening. You do not need to remember names or dates. You do not need to focus. You can simply listen and allow the story to continue at its natural, unhurried pace. As Rome continued to exist, its people adapted to routine. Daily life followed predictable patterns: morning activities, work during the day, rest in the evening, again and again. There were leaders, but their actions were mostly administrative. There were laws, but they were discussed slowly. Nothing changed suddenly. Everything progressed calmly. Rome did not become significant overnight. It became what it was, through patience, through repetition, and through time. A great deal of time. There is no climax approaching. Nothing you need to stay awake for. History continues, slowly, quietly, and without interruption. You can relax now. There is no urgency. The story will continue in the same calm manner. As time continued to pass, Rome remained focused on routine. Daily life followed familiar patterns. People woke up early, completed their work, and returned home when the day ended. There was little variation. Most days felt the same. The city slowly became more organized. Simple systems were put in place. Rules were written and followed. These rules were not dramatic. They were practical. They existed to keep things moving, slowly and predictably. Rome did not rush toward change. Adjustments happened gradually. When problems appeared, they were addressed calmly, one issue at a time. Nothing required immediate attention. Leadership in Rome was structured. Responsibilities were shared. Decisions were discussed at length. Meetings often lasted longer than necessary. Many discussions ended without clear outcomes. This was normal. Administrative tasks increased. Records were kept, lists were maintained, and documents accumulated. Most of these records were ordinary. They described daily matters, supplies, rules, and schedules. Life continued quietly. Rome expanded its influence slowly, not through sudden action, but through consistency. Nearby areas were incorporated gradually. Processes were repeated again and again. Nothing changed quickly. Time continued to pass. Years went by. People adapted to routine. They became comfortable with repetition. Work followed familiar rhythms, morning activities, afternoon tasks, evening rest. This pattern repeated endlessly. There was no urgency, no pressure to move faster. Rome functioned because it was patient. Structures were built carefully. Roads were planned methodically. Nothing was rushed. Everything required approval, and approval took time, long periods of time. The population grew steadily, but life remained calm. Most people focused on small concerns: food, shelter, and order. There was no need for excitement. Nothing demanded attention. Rome continued to exist, quietly, steadily, and without interruption. If you are still listening, there is no need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. There are no significant events approaching. You can allow your thoughts to drift. Time is moving slowly. History is unfolding gently. There is no rush. Everything will continue at the same calm pace. You can relax. The story will proceed quietly, without urgency and without change. As Rome continued to exist, daily life became increasingly structured. People grew accustomed to routine. Each day followed a similar pattern. Morning began quietly, with simple preparations and familiar tasks. Work filled most hours of the day. Activities were repeated regularly. There was little variation. This repetition became normal. People expected nothing different. Rome functioned through consistency. Small decisions were made often, but they rarely changed anything. Administrative duties increased gradually. Officials spent time reviewing documents. Lists were examined, records were updated, and schedules were adjusted. Most of these tasks were ordinary. There was no urgency. Nothing required immediate action. Time passed slowly. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Life continued without interruption. Rome expanded its systems carefully. Rules were clarified. Procedures were repeated. Instructions were followed exactly. There was no reason to hurry. Everything progressed at a measured pace. People adapted easily. Routine became comforting. Predictability was expected. Nothing surprised anyone. Construction projects moved forward slowly. Materials were gathered. Plans were reviewed. Work continued methodically. Progress was steady, but never fast. Roads were extended carefully. Each step required approval. Approval required discussion. Discussion required time, often a great deal of time. Meetings continued regularly. Many of them were long. Most produced no immediate result. This was common. Nothing was considered urgent. The population grew gradually, but daily life remained calm. People focused on basic needs: food, shelter, and order. There was little concern beyond that. Rome continued to exist quietly, without excitement, without disruption. Time moved forward, slowly, steadily, and predictably. There was no need to pay attention. Nothing significant is happening. There are no important moments approaching. You can remain relaxed. History is unfolding calmly, without pressure, without urgency. Everything continues at the same slow pace, and there is nothing you need to do. As time continued to move forward, Rome remained deeply connected to routine. Daily life changed very little from one day to the next. People followed familiar paths, performed familiar tasks, and returned to familiar places. There was comfort in repetition. Nothing unexpected occurred. Morning arrived quietly. People prepared for the day in the same manner. Work began without urgency. Tasks were completed slowly and carefully. There was no pressure to finish quickly. Time was available, plenty of time. Rome functioned because of patience. Administrative systems continued to grow. Officials reviewed records repeatedly. Documents were written, then reviewed, then written again. Most of this work was unremarkable. It involved numbers, lists, and routine observations. Nothing about it was exciting. Meetings were scheduled regularly. They often lasted for long periods. Discussions repeated familiar points. Little changed as a result. This was expected. Rome preferred stability. Changes were avoided when possible. If change occurred, it happened slowly, gradually, almost unnoticed. Construction projects moved forward at a measured pace. Materials were gathered slowly. Plans were examined carefully. Work began only after long consideration. Progress was steady, but never fast. Roads were extended carefully. Each step required approval. Approval required discussion. Discussion required time, often a great deal of time. This process repeated itself continuously. People became accustomed to waiting. Waiting was normal. There was no reason to hurry. Rome did not value speed. It valued order, predictability, and routine. The population continued to grow, but daily life remained unchanged. People focused on basic needs. Food was prepared simply, shelter was maintained carefully, order was preserved quietly. There was little concern beyond these matters. Entertainment was modest, rest was valued, silence was common. Rome existed without noise, without urgency, without interruption. Time moved forward evenly. Days followed days. Weeks followed weeks. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required focus. There were no dramatic moments approaching. History continued in the background, slowly, calmly, without pressure. You do not need to remember any details. You do not need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. Everything is proceeding as expected. At the same steady pace, there is no rush, there is no urgency, only time, passing quietly, as it always has. You can relax now. There is nothing to do, nothing to anticipate, nothing to prepare for. The story will continue in the same calm manner, without change, without interruption, and without effort. As the Roman world continued to exist, daily life remained steady and predictable. There were no sudden changes, no moments of urgency. People continued to follow routines. They woke up at familiar hours, prepared for the day, and moved through the same spaces. Work continued quietly. Tasks were completed in the same order, using the same methods. Day after day, nothing required immediate attention. Rome functioned because it avoided haste. Decisions were made slowly, often after repeated discussions. Many discussions led to no visible outcome. This was accepted as normal. Administrative life expanded further. More records were kept. More lists were written. More schedules were maintained. Officials spent long hours reviewing documents. Most documents described ordinary matters, supplies, transport, maintenance, and minor concerns. Nothing dramatic appeared in these records. Meetings continued regularly. They followed familiar structures. Topics were discussed repeatedly. Points were restated, clarified, and then postponed. This cycle repeated endlessly. Rome preferred stability over speed. Change was considered carefully and often delayed. Construction projects continued. Materials were gathered gradually. Plans were reviewed slowly, and work proceeded step by step. Nothing was rushed. Each stage required approval. Approval required discussion. Discussion required time, often more time than expected. People became accustomed to waiting. Waiting became part of daily life. There was no pressure to accelerate. The Roman system valued patience. Roads were extended carefully. Each section measured, reviewed, and approved. Progress was visible, but slow. Very slow. Life within the empire remained calm. Most people focused on immediate concerns: food preparation, basic labor, and rest. Entertainment remained simple. Quiet was common. Silence was not unusual. Time continued to move forward evenly. Days passed without distinction. Weeks followed weeks. Seasons changed gradually. Nothing required attention. Nothing demanded focus. The empire expanded administratively, not suddenly, not dramatically. Systems were extended methodically. Procedures were copied, repeated, and standardized. Uniformity became important. Predictability was valued. People understood what was expected. This reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty was avoided whenever possible. Rome continued to exist in this manner, calm, ordered, and consistent. As years passed, generations followed familiar patterns. Children learned routines from adults. Adults continued routines learned earlier. Very little changed. This continuity defined Roman life. Even as the empire grew larger, daily existence remained modest. Most people were unaware of distant regions. They focused on their immediate surroundings, work, rest, and repetition. There was no sense of urgency, no expectation of sudden change. Rome continued because it maintained balance. Too much change was avoided. Too much speed was discouraged. The system relied on slow movement, gradual adjustment, and repetition. As time went on, minor inefficiencies appeared, but they were addressed slowly, carefully, without haste. Processes were adjusted, then reviewed, then adjusted again. Nothing was finalized quickly. Everything required time. The Roman world accepted this pace. It was familiar. It was expected. And it was stable. Life continued quietly, without interruption, without excitement, without urgency. Time moved forward, at the same steady rhythm. You do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. There is no climax approaching. Everything continues calmly, exactly as before, and exactly as expected. As time continued its steady movement, life across the Roman Empire remained largely unchanged. Daily routines persisted. People continued to wake at familiar hours, perform familiar tasks, and return to familiar places. There was comfort in this repetition. Nothing unexpected interrupted the flow of days. Work continued quietly. Tasks were completed methodically. without urgency, and without variation. The Roman system relied heavily on consistency. Consistency reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty was avoided whenever possible. Administrative processes continued to expand. Records were updated regularly, lists were revised, and schedules were maintained. Most of this work was repetitive, and deliberately so. Meetings continued to take place. They followed established formats. Topics were discussed calmly, often repeating previous conclusions. Decisions were postponed when possible. Postponement was preferred to haste. Rome did not value speed. It valued order. Construction projects moved forward steadily. Materials were delivered gradually. Plans were reviewed carefully, and work progressed step by step. Nothing was rushed. Each stage required confirmation. Confirmation required discussion. Discussion required time, often more time than expected. Waiting became an accepted part of life. People adjusted their expectations. They learned patience. Roads continued to be extended slowly, each segment measured, approved, and completed. Progress was visible, but never rapid. Life within the empire remained quiet. Most people focused on immediate needs, food preparation, basic labor, and rest. Entertainment remained modest. Silence was common, noise was unnecessary. Time continued to pass evenly. Days followed days, without distinction. Weeks passed quietly. Seasons changed gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required focus. The empire functioned because it avoided disruption. Disruption created uncertainty, and uncertainty was unwelcome. Systems were maintained carefully. Procedures were repeated consistently. Predictability was preserved. People understood what was expected of them. This understanding reduced tension. Rome continued in this manner, calm, orderly, and methodical. As years passed, minor adjustments occurred, but always slowly, always cautiously. Nothing changed abruptly. Life remained steady. The pace remained slow. Time continued its quiet movement. There was no urgency, no climax, no sudden conclusion. Everything proceeded as it always had, calmly, predictably. Without interruption, you do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. There is nothing to anticipate. You can remain relaxed. The story continues quietly, at the same steady pace. As the Roman system continued to operate, life across the empire remained structured and predictable. Daily routines stayed largely the same. People woke at familiar hours, prepared for familiar tasks, and followed established patterns. There was little variation. Work continued quietly. Tasks were completed in the same sequence, using the same methods, day after day. The Roman administrative system became more detailed. More procedures were introduced, not to create change, but to preserve order. Officials relied heavily on repetition. Forms were reviewed, documents were copied, and records were stored. Most of this work was ordinary. It involved minor details, routine checks, and slow verification. Nothing required urgency. Rome preferred caution over speed. Decisions were rarely final. They were discussed, reconsidered, and often delayed. Delay was acceptable. Delay reduced risk. Meetings continued to follow familiar patterns. Participants listened patiently, spoke calmly, and repeated known arguments. Many meetings ended without resolution. This was expected. The Roman system did not seek quick outcomes. It valued stability. Stability reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty was avoided whenever possible. Construction projects continued steadily. Materials arrived gradually. Plans were reviewed carefully. And progress advanced step by step. Nothing was rushed. Each phase required confirmation. Confirmation required discussion. Discussion required time. Waiting became normal. People adjusted their expectations. They learned to be patient. Road networks expanded slowly. Each section measured, approved, and completed in sequence. Progress was visible, but slow. Life within the empire remained calm. Most individuals focused on immediate responsibilities: food preparation, basic labor, and rest. Entertainment was modest. Silence was common. Noise was unnecessary. Time continued its steady movement. Days passed without distinction. Weeks followed weeks. Seasons changed gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required focus. The empire functioned because it minimized disruption. Disruption created uncertainty. Uncertainty was unwelcome. Systems were preserved carefully. Procedures were repeated consistently. Predictability was maintained. People understood what was expected of them. This understanding created calm. Rome continued in this manner, ordered, measured, and deliberate. As years passed, minor adjustments occurred, but always slowly, always cautiously. Nothing changed abruptly. Life remained steady. The pace remained controlled. Time moved forward quietly. There was no urgency, no climax, no sudden shift. Everything proceeded as before, calmly, predictably, without interruption. You do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. There is nothing to anticipate. You can remain relaxed. The story continues quietly, at the same steady pace. As time continued to pass steadily, the Roman Empire remained guided by routine. Daily life changed very little. People continued to rely on familiar structures and established habits. Each day followed a predictable rhythm. Morning activities began quietly. Work progressed without urgency, and rest arrived at the expected time. There was comfort in this repetition. Nothing unexpected interrupted the flow of life. The administrative system remained central. Officials reviewed documents carefully, often more than once, to ensure consistency. Records were updated slowly and stored methodically. Most records described ordinary matters, supply levels, maintenance schedules, and routine responsibilities. Nothing about this work was dramatic. Meetings continued regularly. They were calm, orderly, and often lengthy. Topics were discussed patiently, with little variation. The same points were raised, clarified, and repeated. Resolutions were rare, but this was acceptable. Rome valued caution. Caution reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was avoided whenever possible. Construction activity continued at a measured pace. Materials were delivered gradually, plans were reviewed carefully, and progress advanced step by step. Each stage required confirmation. Confirmation required discussion. Discussion required time. Waiting was expected. People became accustomed to this pace. Roads continued to extend slowly. Each section followed established procedures, from planning to approval to completion. Progress was visible, but never rapid. Life within the empire remained quiet. Most people focused on immediate tasks, food preparation, basic labor, and rest. Entertainment remained simple. Silence was common. Time continued its steady movement. Days passed without distinction. Weeks followed weeks, and seasons changed gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required focus. The empire functioned because it maintained balance. Balance required patience. Patience required repetition. Systems were preserved carefully. Procedures were followed consistently. Predictability was maintained. People understood expectations. This understanding created calm. Rome continued to exist in this manner, organized, deliberate, and stable. As years passed, small adjustments occurred, but always slowly, always cautiously. Nothing changed abruptly. Life remained steady. The pace remained controlled. Time moved forward quietly. There was no urgency, no climax, no sudden change. Everything proceeded as before, calmly, predictably, without interruption. You do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. There is nothing to anticipate. You can remain relaxed. The story continues quietly, at the same steady pace. Slowly, always cautiously. Nothing changed abruptly. Life remained steady. The pace remained controlled. Time moved forward quietly. There was no urgency, no climax, no sudden change. Everything proceeded as before, calmly, predictably, without interruption. You do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. There is nothing to anticipate. You can remain relaxed. The story continues quietly, at the same steady pace. As the Roman Empire continued its quiet progression, daily life remained shaped by familiarity. People relied on routines that had changed very little over time. Each day followed a predictable sequence. Morning began calmly. Work proceeded without urgency, and rest arrived as expected. There was reassurance in this consistency. Nothing unexpected disturbed the rhythm of life. The administrative structure continued to operate steadily. Officials worked through routine responsibilities, reviewing documents, updating records, and maintaining schedules. Most of these tasks were repetitive. They involved careful checking, simple verification, and orderly storage. Nothing required haste. Rome preferred patience over speed. Decisions were rarely immediate. They were discussed calmly, considered carefully, and often delayed. Delay allowed stability. Stability reduced uncertainty. Meetings continued to follow established patterns. Participants listened patiently, spoke deliberately, and repeated familiar points. Outcomes were modest. This was normal. The empire valued predictability. Predictability created calm. Construction activity continued at a measured pace. Materials arrived gradually. Plans were reviewed thoroughly, and progress advanced step by step. Nothing was rushed. Each phase required confirmation. Confirmation required discussion. Discussion required time. Waiting was expected. People adapted to this pace. Roads continued to extend slowly. Each section followed standard procedures, from planning to approval to completion. Progress was visible, but never rapid. Life within the empire remained quiet. Most people focused on immediate concerns, food preparation, basic labor, and rest. Entertainment remained simple. Silence was common. Time continued to move forward evenly. Days passed without distinction. Weeks followed weeks, and seasons changed gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required focus. The empire functioned because it avoided disruption. Disruption created uncertainty, and uncertainty was unwelcome. Systems were maintained carefully, procedures were followed consistently, predictability was preserved, people understood expectations. This understanding created calm. Rome continued to exist in this manner, ordered, deliberate, and stable. As years passed, minor adjustments occurred, but always slowly, always cautiously. As time continued its slow and steady course, the Roman Empire remained defined by routine. Daily life followed familiar structures and predictable habits. People relied on repetition and found comfort in consistency. Each day unfolded in much the same way. Morning arrived quietly, work continued methodically, and rest followed without surprise. There was no urgency. Nothing required immediate action. The administrative system continued to function. Officials carried out routine tasks, reviewing documents, updating records, and maintaining schedules. Most of this work was repetitive. It involved checking details, verifying information, and ensuring consistency. Nothing about it was exciting. Meetings continued regularly. They followed established procedures and familiar formats. Participants spoke calmly, listened patiently, and repeated known points. Decisions were rarely final. They were often delayed, reconsidered, and discussed again. Delay was acceptable. It reduced risk. Rome valued caution. Caution created stability. Stability reduced uncertainty. Construction projects continued at a measured pace. Materials were gathered gradually, plans were reviewed carefully, and progress advanced step by step. Nothing was rushed. Each stage required approval. Approval required discussion. Discussion required time. Waiting was expected. People adapted to this rhythm. Roads continued to extend slowly. Each section followed standard procedures, from planning to approval to completion. Progress was steady, but slow. Life within the empire remained calm. Most individuals focused on immediate responsibilities: food preparation, basic labor, and rest. Entertainment remained modest. Silence was common. Time continued to move forward evenly. Days passed without distinction. Weeks followed weeks, and seasons changed gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required focus. The empire functioned because it avoided disruption. Disruption created uncertainty, and uncertainty was unwelcome. Systems were preserved carefully. Procedures were repeated consistently. Predictability was maintained. People understood their roles. This understanding created calm. Rome continued to exist quietly, orderly, stable, and consistent. As time passed, small changes occurred, but always slowly, always cautiously. Nothing changed abruptly. Life remained steady. The pace remained controlled. Time moved forward calmly. There was no urgency, no climax, no sudden conclusion. Everything continued as before, calmly, predictably, without interruption. You do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. There is nothing to anticipate. You can remain relaxed. The story continues quietly, at the same steady pace. As the long passage of time continued, the Roman Empire remained steady in its final rhythm. Daily life carried on much as it always had. People continued their routines, without expectation, and without urgency. Each day followed the familiar pattern. Morning arrived quietly, work proceeded calmly, and rest came naturally. There was no sense of anticipation. Nothing new was expected. The systems that had guided Roman life for so long continued to function. Records were maintained, procedures were followed, and schedules were observed. Most actions were automatic by now. People knew what to do and when to do it. Meetings continued to occur, though their importance slowly faded. Discussions were calm, often repetitive, and rarely decisive. Decisions were delayed or left unresolved. This felt normal. The empire had learned to move slowly. Speed was unnecessary. Change was gradual, almost unnoticeable. Construction continued in a limited way. Maintenance replaced expansion. Repair replaced growth. Everything focused on preservation. Roads remained in use, buildings were maintained, and systems continued quietly. Life within the empire remained modest. Most people focused on simple concerns: food, shelter, and rest. Entertainment was limited. Silence was common. Time continued to pass evenly. Days followed days, weeks followed weeks, and seasons changed as they always had. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required focus. The Roman Empire did not end suddenly. It faded slowly, through small changes and gradual shifts. There was no single moment, no clear ending, only time continuing forward. People adapted, as they always had. History moved on quietly, without ceremony, without urgency. The story reaches a natural pause, not an ending, but a moment of rest. You do not need to remember details. You do not need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. Time will continue to pass, slowly, quietly, and without interruption. The story rests here, at the same calm pace.